Hey there, welcome, and my name is Naga, and in this video series we're dealing with a very important fundamental concept in JavaScript called the execution context and this keyword. It's very important because you get a lot of interview questions based on this concept, and since it is a little tricky, a little magic-y kind of concept, it is very important that you practice a lot with this concept. Try to understand it in depth, try to go through every possible scenario and understand it in each of those scenarios, why it is working the way it is working, and that will really help you pick it up very fast. As far as this series is concerned, I'm trying to make around 6 videos. This is the first one. It's kind of an introductory video, and I will be working on a series of concepts. We will do a lot of looking at the code and putting the code in an editor and executing it and seeing how it works, and understanding how why it works the way it works, right? So in this particular video, we'll look at the agenda. We'll talk about what the execution context really means in JavaScript, and we'll talk about something called strict mode in JavaScript, and how this keyword varies in strict mode, and then we'll dive into the next one. Right? Let me quickly show you. So this is the agenda. We'll talk about the execution context, like I said, and we'll talk about the useStrict string, which is introduced in ECMAScript 5, and the global this and how it affects. From then on, we'll move to an important concept called where to define a function, right? With regards to the execution context, how a location of a function matters, and what happens when we put a function in an object literal, and then what happens when we put a function inside of a member method of that object literal. So all these things, we'll look at that with examples, and we'll get a better idea of that. And then we'll also look at something called function invocation. There are different ways of invoking functions, and we will look at that, and then we'll see how this context will vary based on this invocation. So that's a very interesting one, right? And we will also look at a very important topic that has newly come because of the ECMAScript 6, which is arrow functions. And we'll look at from the perspective of this context how arrow functions play a critical role, a very major role, and basically how where we declare them affects this context, and how we invoke them affects the context, and all those things. So from the perspective of arrow functions, we'll take a look at all those things that we did in the previous ones, and then we'll conclude by just looking at recapping everything that we did. So this should probably take up like 5-6 videos. So let's dive in. Alright, so first one, what is the execution context, right? What is this? So this obviously comes from an object-oriented programming background, right? So when JavaScript was prepared initially, it was created by some guy called Brendan Eich, and when he created, he thought if object-oriented programming was also part of JavaScript, then many people who were already doing object-oriented programming in Java and other languages would be willing to work on JavaScript. So that is how the whole object-oriented thing came into JavaScript. And then this keyword is a very important thing in the object-oriented programming. That refers to the current object that you're dealing with. But in JavaScript especially, when we have functions, we don't have just classes, right? When you talk about object-oriented programming, we talk about classes, but here we have functions. And so it is really important to understand from the perspective of the functions how this keyword works. That is the whole purpose, the whole agenda of this series of videos, right? So the this keyword refers here to the object a function is given at the time of running the function, or at the runtime, or when it is invoked, based on how it is invoked, right? For arrow functions, as we know, there's a new type of functions in JavaScript called arrow functions, and this context primarily gets decided based on where it is created, rather than how it is invoked and all those things. So okay, just to recap, how this context varies. These are the main things that we need to know, or that we need to consider when we are determining the value of this. First one is whether we're using useStrict or not in our document or within our function, and the second one, the most important one, is how the function is invoked, right? This is most important one for normal functions, and there's the third one called where the function is declared. This becomes more important when we are using arrow functions. And then the fourth one is whether we are using an arrow function or not, which actually affects point 2 and 3, right? Okay, so enough about that. This is a brief introduction. We can move on to the next one. Alright, here we discuss a little bit about the strict mode. So strict mode came generally it came in ECMAScript 5, and it has come in as a remedy for a very serious problem that existed before ECMAScript 5, which is that the global object gets polluted because of certain errors that developers make. Sometimes one classic example is that if you create a variable, if you use a variable without creating it using var, that variable name, JavaScript actually creates attaches that particular variable to the global object, which would actually pollute the global object. And there are many other things that used to be bad practices before ECMAScript 5, before the useStrict was introduced. Now, if you use this keyword in a function, and that function is anywhere, it could be in the global root level, or it could be within another function or in another file or anything, it would always point to the window object before ECMAScript 5, even after ECMAScript 5. If you don't use useStrict, it would always point to the global object, which is the window. In case of Node.js, it is called global this. The global object is called global this, and in case of browser, it is called the window, right? So let's quickly look at this in action. So what I will do is I will come to my browser and open a code editor, in this case a website called repl.it, and then I will paste this function, and this is a simple function, nothing fancy, and I will execute that function. Our beautiful foo function here, what it does is it just compares this keyword in that function to the window, and not surprising, it points to true. It points to the window, and this statement is true. Whereas if you use the useStrict keyword, useStrict string is not a keyword basically. You have to put this string at the beginning of your file, and then when you do that, this context will not point to the window, right? It will point to undefined. Actually, it will be undefined. So if I simply log this, it says undefined. So that is what useStrict does to us. So in the upcoming videos, whenever I say that this context, or that this prop, sorry, not the prop, that this keyword, right, when it points, if I say that it points to the global object, I really meant in a non-strict mode, but in strict mode it will always point to undefined. So that is something I thought I would clarify beforehand. So there we go. So that is about the strict mode. And so in this video we've covered a brief introduction, our agenda, and then the definition or the general understanding of this context, and the role the strict mode plays in determining this context as well. So in the next one we will dive right into the other topics, and then hopefully I'll see you there.